Hello and welcome to this, the third episode of A Word from the Wise. This is our philosophy series focusing on the A-level epistemology syllabus. Today we're joined by Professor Daniel Whiting, covering Unit 3.1.3, Reason as a Source of Knowledge. Due to the smaller scope of this segment of the syllabus, we're also going to discuss Descartes' arguments for God beyond the demands of the syllabus. And of course, if you do enjoy the episode, please make sure to check out our others, including Skepticism, Perception as a Source of Knowledge, and, of course, our first episode, What is Knowledge? And just before we start, I want to give a quick apology regarding the rest of the recording. We had an issue with the pop filters, or more accurately, the unfortunate lack thereof, so please excuse the background noises that couldn't be edited out in this episode. Thank you.
So the first topic is whether we have innate ideas. When philosophers talk about innate ideas, what they have in mind are ideas that we are born with, and more broadly, ideas that come with us the moment we create it. So whatever moment it is that we come into being, the moment of our creation, there are certain ideas that we're born with. So that's the idea of innate ideas. The thought that we have innate ideas that we're born with, dates back at least to the ancient Greeks, but it received a lot of attention in the early modern period, so the 1700s and the 1800s, especially among European thinkers in the rationalist tradition, perhaps the most famous of which was Descartes. So Descartes thought that there were certain ideas that we're born with or that come with us from the very moment that we're created, and the candidate ideas that were innate in us are things like the idea of God, ideas of number, ideas of very general features of reality. So, for example, the idea of a substance, that was another candidate for being an innate idea. And very roughly, Descartes thought, and many other rationalist philosophers thought, that these ideas must be innate in us, we must be born with them, because firstly, they couldn't have come from experience. It looks like the objects of these ideas, the things that these are ideas of, in some cases things that we couldn't possibly experience, like numbers. They don't look like they're the things that our sensory apparatus pick up on. So one reason why they thought these ideas were innate is that they just couldn't be acquired through experience. Another reason why they thought these ideas are innate is that many rationalist philosophers thought that to be able to think about stuff, to be able to think about the world in a meaningful way, we have to already be equipped with certain ideas to make sense of the experience that we're having. So we couldn't even have coherent thoughts about reality, we couldn't even make sense of the experience that we're receiving if we weren't born with or come ready equipped with certain ideas that would then structure our thinking and govern our thinking about the world. So that's the idea of innate ideas. And some of the opponents of the rationalist tradition, so the British empiricists, were very resistant to the idea that we have innate ideas, very critical of this idea. And the most famous critic was John Locke, the English philosopher. So John Locke, in his essay on human understanding, argued at length against the view that we have innate ideas. How does his argument against innate ideas go? Well, the first thing he says is this: what does it mean to say that these ideas are innate? And the first answer to that he considers is to say, well, if an idea is innate, then it's an idea that everybody has. So the fact that certain ideas are universal would be evidence that they're innate. So if every human being in existence has certain ideas, then those ideas, one might think, are innate, or there's at least reason to think that they're innate. So Locke was very dismissive of this. He was dismissive of it for at least two reasons. Firstly, he said, it's just false that there are any ideas that are universal. So he cites as an example, and this is the language of the day, not my own language, children and idiots, among the examples of people or subjects that don't seem to have these ideas. So they don't seem to have the ideas of God, perhaps, or the ideas of number, or the ideas of substance that many philosophers thought to be innate. So his first kind of flat-footed position is it's just not true that any of these ideas are universally held. But then he grants to his critic and says, well, look, even if they were universally held, even if everybody had these ideas, that wouldn't prove them innate. Why? Well, it might be just that these are ideas that occur to anyone from the moment they begin to think or from the moment they begin to perceive. So maybe they're just obvious things to have ideas of. So you might have thought that the principle that 1 and 1 is 2 is innate. That's a mathematical principle that we're born with. But Locke says the fact that everyone agrees to this doesn't show that it's innate, it just shows that it's obvious. It's a self-evident truth that 1 and 1 is 2. So we don't have to imagine that that's a principle that's ingrained in our minds from our creation. So Locke, as we've just discussed, thinks that there are no ideas that are innate. So we might ask, where do our ideas come from? And Locke's reply is that they all come from experience, from sensory or perceptual experience. So all of the ideas that we have are ideas that come to us when we open our eyes or our mouths or our ears to the world around us. The rationalist philosophers that Locke was targeting also agreed that many of our ideas come from experience. So that was something that all parties agreed to. Everyone agrees that some of our ideas come from experience. What's distinctive of the Lockean position and what's distinctive of the empiricist tradition to which he belongs more generally is that Locke thinks that all of our ideas come from experience. So on the one hand, you have Locke and the empiricists that claim all of our ideas come from experience. And on the other hand, you have Descartes and the rationalist tradition that claim that at least some of our ideas don't come from experience. So that's where the disagreement between them lies. And sometimes Locke's position is described as follows. According to Locke, our mind is a tabula rasa, which means roughly a blank slate. So the idea is that the mind, when we come into being, is just a blank slate, and then with our chalks, we mark various things on it, and that's supposed to correspond to the acquisition of ideas through experience. So the mind is blank when it's first created, and then is occupied by ideas that we gain through experience. So again, the key disagreement between the rationalists and the empiricists is over whether at least some ideas are innate. They all agree that some ideas are acquired through experience. The dispute is over whether there's an exception to that rule, whether there are some ideas that are innate or born with us, or in some other way don't come from experience. One of the rationalist philosophers that followed from Descartes, one of Descartes' successors, was the German philosopher Leibniz. And Leibniz, in response to Locke's critique, mounted a defense of the idea that there are innate ideas. And to appreciate how exactly he responds to Locke, it's worth adding another of the points that Locke makes in his critique of the idea of innate ideas. So when he's thinking about children who seem not to have the idea of God, for example, or seem not to have the idea of certain numbers, or whatever the candidate innate ideas are, Locke anticipates a reply. Locke's critic might say to him, okay, I grant that there are children who seem not to be aware of or consciously aware of God or number or whatever your favourite idea is, seem not to be actively employing these ideas, but, the response continues, these ideas are latent or dormant in them. So although at present the child might not seem to grasp these ideas, it's still in them, and it will be activated at a later point as their experience, as they acquire experience of the world and as they acquire instruction from other adults. So the idea here is that ideas are innate, not in the sense that they're subjects who have these ideas are consciously aware of them, but they're innate in the sense that we're born with the inbuilt capacity or disposition to have these ideas of which we're consciously aware. So that's a move that Locke anticipates, and his reply is twofold. So firstly, he thinks that it's just a nonsense to suggest that there are ideas that we're not aware of or that we're not conscious of. So the suggestion that there could be ideas in us that we're not yet aware of, Locke thinks is just a contradiction in terms, because as Locke understands the word idea, ideas are just things that you're consciously aware of. You can't have an idea that you're not conscious of. And so he thinks it's a nonsense to suggest that we could have innate ideas that we're not yet aware of, or that children, for example, could have innate ideas that they're not yet aware of. And on that score, he seems to agree with Descartes. So Descartes defines thinking as an activity of consciousness. So it seems like it's consistent with Descartes' view, or implied by Descartes' view rather, that all the ideas or thoughts that we have are ideas or thoughts of which we're conscious. So that's Locke's first reply. He says it's just a nonsense to think that we could have ideas of which we're not conscious. But his second reply is the maybe more interesting or deeper point. He thinks that if we just say that an idea is innate in the sense that, depending on how our experience unfolds, we'll end up having that idea, he thinks then the dispute over whether there are innate ideas or not comes to nothing, because it looks like a merely terminological disagreement. So on the one hand, we have people who deny that there are innate ideas, and on the other hand, we have people who say that there are innate ideas. But everyone agrees that there are certain ideas that we could have were we to experience the world in a certain kind of way, or that there are certain ideas that we would form were we to receive instruction of a certain sort. So Locke says that once we define the notion of an innate idea as an idea that we would have were our experience to unfold in a certain kind of way, then everyone's agreeing. Everyone agrees that we have the capacity to form these ideas. That doesn't show that we're born with them or that they're innate. So that's a response Locke gives to a move he imagines his critic making. And that leads us into one of the later great rationalist philosophers who responded in writing to Locke's work, Leibniz, the German philosopher. So Leibniz, although he disagreed with Descartes on many, many issues, was part of the rationalist tradition that Descartes helped to inaugurate. And he wanted to defend the idea that there are innate ideas, or the claim that there are innate ideas. In particular, Leibniz responds to Locke's objection to the view that innate ideas are ideas that we're disposed to form in response to experience or instruction. So again, Locke's claim is, if that's all we mean by innate, then there's no distinction between the ideas that are not innate and the ideas that are innate, because for any idea we have, we must have already had the capacity to form that idea in response to experience. So Leibniz wants to distinguish kind of two senses of capacity, and these are my words, not Leibniz's, but we could call it a weak sense of capacity and a strong sense of capacity. So in the weak sense, to say that you're capable of doing something is just to say that if circumstances are conducive, you'll do it. But in the strong sense, to say that you have the capacity to do something is to say that somehow it's kind of written into your nature or into your being that when circumstances are conducive, you'll do that thing. So an example of what we might have in mind when we think about the capacity in the strong sense is birds that travel south for winter. So when the winter comes, the birds travel south, and it's not an accident that they do that. It's somehow, and I'll leave it to ornithologists to tell us how, somehow it's built into the nature of birds, into their being, to respond to changes in climate in that way and to head south. So what Leibniz wants to say is that ideas are innate in us in that strong sense. So we have an inbuilt natural inclination or disposition to form these ideas. And the famous analogy that he uses is that of a sculptor sculpting a block of marble. And as Leibniz tells the story, within the marble are various veins. So we might imagine a beautiful white block of marble with grey and black veins running through it. And what a good sculptor might do as they carve the sculpture is be guided by the veins in the marble. The shape that they produce is going to be a shape that is sensitive to the various grains that you find in the marble, so that the resultant statue somehow was influenced by the veins that you find running through the rock. And Leibniz's view is that it's like that with us and our ideas, that we have certain natural inbuilt tendencies, and experience might chip away at us in the way that the sculptor might chip away at the block of marble. And what it does is reveal these ideas that were there all along, just as the sculptor reveals the veins of marble that were there all along. So what Leibniz wants to say is that it is a meaningful claim to say that we have innate ideas, because it's not just that we happen to have these ideas when experience unfolds in a certain way, it's that there's a natural inbuilt tendency for us, or inclination for us, to have these ideas, that it's written into our nature that we're going to have these ideas in suitable circumstances. Our starting topic was innate ideas, and I said at the beginning that Descartes thinks that among the ideas in us that are innate, that is to say, among the ideas that come with us into existence and that we don't derive from, for example, experience, is the idea of God. Descartes has a lot to say about God, and he has at least two attempts to prove that God exists. And one of those attempts is also supposed to reveal that the idea of God is innate in us. So that's a very natural place for us to start. Before we get there, it might be worth just doing a little bit of setup to situate Descartes' arguments for the proof of God within his broader philosophy. Descartes is very well known for applying what's sometimes called the method of doubt. So in his effort to find secure foundations for scientific and philosophical inquiry, Descartes recommended to us that we reject all and any beliefs that are open to doubt. So anything that admits of the slightest doubt, we should reject as a possible basis for knowledge. So the issue of what we can know and the limits of our knowledge, and whether the method of doubt that I've just briefly described leads us to a skeptical position, where the skeptic is someone who denies that we can know anything. That's an issue that will be explored in episode 4 of this series. So I'll set that aside for now. But the point is that once he's applied the method of doubt, Descartes finds himself in a position where all of his familiar beliefs, all of the beliefs he's acquired during his upbringing, all of the beliefs that he's acquired through his education, all of the beliefs that he's acquired through experience, all of these things have been set aside because he claims they're all open to doubt. Where does that leave Descartes? Well, his first observation is that it leaves him certain of his own existence. So even if he is uncertain of everything else, he can at least be certain of his own existence. Why? Well, because in subjecting things to doubt, he is doubting, and he can't doubt his own existence because the very activity of doubting reveals his own existence. You can only have doubt if you have a person that is doubting. So Descartes thought that his own existence as a subject capable of doubt, and more generally as a subject capable of thought, couldn't be open to doubt. And as he famously puts it, I think, therefore I am. So this is sometimes known as the cogito, from the Latin cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So at this point in Descartes' inquiry, he's assured of his own existence. And he isn't assured of his own existence by perceptual means. It's not like he's looked in the mirror and seen himself, because that would be to rely on the senses, and for reasons you'll discuss in another episode, he thinks that the senses can be open to doubt. He's assured of his own existence because he has, as it were, intuited it. He can just see from the very activity of his thinking that a thinker must exist. How does all of this relate to God? Well, now that Descartes has assured himself of his own existence, again something that he takes himself to know by intuition rather than by perception, he reflects on what else he finds, and he's aware that he exists as a thinker, but he's also aware that thinkers have various thoughts, and he's aware of his own thoughts and ideas. He doesn't yet know if anything out in reality corresponds to those ideas, but he at least knows that he has these ideas. So Descartes might be aware that he has an idea of a tree, or he might be aware of the idea of a chair. He doesn't yet know whether there are trees or chairs in reality, but at least he knows he has ideas of these things. So when Descartes is surveying the ideas that he has, he comes across one very interesting idea, which is the idea of God. And from the fact that he has this idea, Descartes attempts to proceed to establish that God must exist. How does that work? It's a bit involved, but let's take it in the stepwise fashion. So again, the first step is that Descartes has an idea of God. The second step is to say that that idea must have come from somewhere. So we have an idea, there has to be an explanation for where that idea came from, or what the cause of that idea is. So it's not just a brute fact about me that I have this idea, it's not something that's inexplicable, there has to be some explanation for where this idea comes from. So that's the second step. First step, I've got an idea of God. Second step, where does this idea come from? The next thing Descartes does is introduce a general principle about causation, where causation is a matter of cause and effect. One thing's causing another. So we might think that drinking too much causes a hangover, or rain causes the streets to be wet. So Descartes is interested in what it is for one thing to be the cause of another thing, for something to cause some effect. And his claim is that whatever you find in an effect, you have to find in its cause. Another way that we might put that is, what you get out, you have to put in. So if an effect has certain characteristics or features, you have to find those characteristics or features, or something a lot like them, in the cause. So here might be an example. Imagine that we have some a heat source and some water next to that heat source that is boiling away. So in many ways these two things are different. The boiling water has got water in it. There's no water in the heat source. We can imagine it's just a gas burner burning away, and the gas is burning away. That's the heat source, and of course you don't find anything corresponding to that in the water boiling. But what Descartes' principle tells us, the principle that whatever you find in the effect you have to find in some form in the cause, it tells us that whatever you find in the boiling water has to be there in some form in the heat source. So what do you find in the boiling water? Well, you find energy, you find thermal energy, and that is what we find in the effect. In the heat source, in the burning gas, we also find thermal energy. So we can understand why the water is boiling. It has a feature, thermal energy, that you find in the cause. And more generally, whatever you find in the effect, you have to find in the cause. So one more thing on this. Just imagine that that's false. Imagine that you have water that's boiling at, say, 100 degrees, but the heat source is only 50 degrees. Well, then we would immediately conclude that the heat source is not the cause of the water boiling, because there's more heat in the water than you find in the source. So either the gas stove is not the cause of the water boiling, or it's not the sole cause. It must be receiving some heat from elsewhere. So this is a general principle that, if we think about examples like that, is supposed to be very plausible. How does it relate to God? Well, remember where we're at. Descartes claims to have an idea of God. He wants to know where that idea came from or what the cause of it is, and now he applies this general principle. The general principle says that whatever you find in the cause, you have to find in the effect. So what that tells us is that whatever we find in the idea of God, we also have to find in the cause. Now the final move. Descartes asks, well, what is my idea of God like? Well, it's the idea of an infinitely perfect being. The idea of a being that has infinite power, infinite knowledge, infinite goodwill, and so on. And so applying the causal principle, it seems to follow that if the idea is infinitely perfect, the cause must be infinitely perfect too. Because if that were not so, you'd be getting more out than you'd be putting in. An infinitely perfect idea must have an infinitely perfect cause, because otherwise you'd have a violation of that causal principle that we were talking about earlier. You'd have a case where you're getting more out than you're putting in. And then it's a very short step to the conclusion that God exists, because I can't be the cause of my idea of God, because I'm not infinitely perfect. But no one else could be the cause of my idea of God, because no one else is infinitely perfect. And indeed, no created or finite thing could be the cause of my idea of God. The only thing that could be the cause of my idea of God, given the principle about causation, is God himself, because only God is infinitely perfect. And so from the fact that Descartes has an idea of God, he concludes that God must exist, because God is the only plausible explanation for where his idea of God came from. And we can relate this back to innate ideas, because what that argument shows is that the idea of God can't have come from experience or through education or through upbringing, because the only plausible cause for the idea of God is God himself. So the idea of God must have come with me from the very moment in which God created me. When God brought me into being, God placed the idea of God in me, or in Descartes, or in anybody else. And so sometimes this argument is known as the trademark argument, because it's like a silversmith stamping their trademark on a ring or a piece of jewelry that they've produced. So when God creates us, he stamps in us the idea of God into our minds. Descartes himself gives an analogy which is supposed to kind of illustrate or help us to understand the line of thought that he's appealing here in an effort to prove that God exists. So this is something that he discusses in his another work called The Principles of Philosophy that he wrote. So he asks us to imagine someone who has come up with an idea for a really incredible machine. So to give a contemporary version of it, you might imagine someone who's come up with the idea of a driverless car that doesn't pollute, just runs on water, an absolutely incredible machine. Well, when we meet someone who has such an idea, one very natural thing to ask is, where did that idea come from? Like, where did you get that idea from, you might ask them. And if it's a really incredible idea, but this person isn't known for having a really incredible intellect, you might wonder whether they came up with it. So if you're aware that this idea is an incredible invention, and you're also aware that this person's intellect is somewhat limited in various ways, or hasn't shown themselves to be particularly clever or bright, you might wonder, well, how can this person, whose mental powers are not that incredible, come up with this really incredible idea? And you might doubt that they really did come up with it if you can't understand how that person could have come up with this idea. And that's exactly how the argument is supposed to work in the case of God. And so we have to find something whose intellect matches the idea, so some being who's got the mental capacity to come up with this idea, and then it looks like the only candidate is God. So what I've tried to do is explain Descartes' argument, or his first argument for thinking that God exists. So he has a second argument, which we'll get to shortly, but before we turn to it, it might be worth stopping to think about possible replies or objections that we might make to Descartes' trademark argument. The trademark argument is not often thought to be particularly successful, so we could just pause to think about one reason why we might be dissatisfied with it. The key move that Descartes makes is to say finite, limited, imperfect creatures like ourselves couldn't have come up with the idea of infinite, unlimited perfection. That would be to get out more than we're putting in. And a common response to Descartes is to say that, well, perhaps we arrive at the idea of perfection by starting with an idea of our own imperfections. So as an imperfect being, I'm well aware of my imperfections. I'm well aware that I'm a limited creature. I know that I fail in various regards. And perhaps I take that as my starting point, and I arrive at the idea of infinite perfection by thinking about how I could be improved. So if I think of some small improvement that I could make to myself, make myself a bit clever or a bit stronger or a bit fitter, and then I can imagine making further improvements, and perhaps by going through this process I can arrive at some idea of what it would be for being to be perfect. So again, I start from my imperfections or my ideas of imperfections and in some way extrapolate the idea of perfection. So then we don't need to appeal to God to explain where the idea of a perfect being came from. I could have arrived at that idea just using my own imperfections, or the idea of imperfection in general, as my starting point. That is an objection that Descartes himself anticipates, and his reply, in short, is to say that that gets things back to front. What Descartes wants to say is that to recognize that you are imperfect, you have to have a prior idea of perfection. So when you think of something as imperfect, you're thinking of it as failing in some respect, or not being quite adequate in some respect. So to think of something as imperfect, you have to have an idea of what it would be for that thing to be perfect, such that it's failing to meet that standard. Another way to put that is to think of something as finite. We have to have some prior conception of what the infinite is, because to be finite is to not be infinite. So our ideas of being finite are kind of parasitic upon or derived from our idea of the infinite. So what Descartes wants to say is that we couldn't have arrived at our idea of infinite perfection by starting from our idea of finite, imperfect beings, because to have or to recognize a being as finite, or to recognize a being as imperfect, we have to have a prior independent conception of what it would be for a being to be perfect or infinite. So the idea of infinity or perfection comes first. It comes before the idea of being finite or being imperfect. So that's Descartes' reply to the objection that I just mentioned. And it relates again to the topic of innate ideas, because at the start I said that the reason that Descartes thought that ideas are innate is that there are certain ideas we have to be able to think or form thoughts about other subject matters. And here's an example of that. To be able to think about imperfection, we have to have in advance an idea of perfection. So that's why Descartes thinks that these kinds of ideas have to be innate. I mentioned a moment ago that Descartes has two arguments for the existence of God. So far we've discussed the argument that is often known as the trademark argument. I'll now explain the argument that is often known as an ontological argument. So this kind of argument has been advanced by lots of other philosophers. Descartes' trademark argument is unique to him. The ontological argument is an argument that in different forms many different philosophers have advanced. So prior to Descartes was a thinker called St. Anselm, and Anselm was one of the first proponents of an ontological argument for the existence of God. Some of Descartes' successors, like Spinoza, another philosopher in the rationalist tradition, developed an ontological argument for the existence of God. So this argument comes in many varieties, but I'll focus on Descartes' version of it here. So again, Descartes starts from his idea of God, and this is supposed to be neutral territory. It's supposed to be a starting point that everyone can accept, because even the atheist, and this is a point Anselm makes, even the atheist has an idea of God, because the atheist thinks that there is no God. So to think that there's no God, you have to have some idea of God. You have to know what it is that you're denying the existence of. So we start from the idea of God, and what Descartes suggests is that when we reflect on the idea of God, we can see that the idea of God is the idea of an infinitely perfect being. That's a point that we've already come across in relation to the trademark argument. So the idea of God is the idea of an infinitely perfect being. Descartes adds that existence is a perfection. It's better to exist than to not exist. Things that exist are more perfect than things that don't exist. So when we reflect on the idea of God, we notice that it's the idea of an infinitely perfect being, and infinite perfection includes existence. And then Descartes very quickly concludes that God must exist, because to deny that God exists would be a contradiction in terms. To say that God doesn't exist would be to say that an infinitely perfect being lacks one of the perfections, existence. If you say that God doesn't exist, it's like saying an infinitely perfect being is imperfect, and that's a contradiction in terms. It's akin to saying that a bachelor is married. The very idea of a bachelor is the idea of a person that is unmarried. Likewise, the very idea of God is the idea of a perfect being, and a perfect being is a being that exists. And so to deny that God exists is like saying a perfect being is imperfect. And so Descartes concludes God must exist. It would be a contradiction to deny otherwise, and contradictions can't be true. So you might wonder what's so special about the idea of God, because we have ideas of many things that don't exist. So I have an idea of unicorns, I have an idea of hobbits, I have an idea of Marvel superheroes, all of these things that don't exist. So why is it that merely having the idea of God guarantees that these things, that God exists, when merely having the idea of a unicorn doesn't guarantee that a unicorn exists? The reason why Descartes thinks that the idea of God is special is that the idea of God is the idea of a perfect being, and the idea of a unicorn is not the idea of a perfect being. It's the idea of a magical horse with a horn. And so there's no contradiction in denying that unicorns exist. That's just to say that a magical horse with a horn doesn't exist. But it is a contradiction to deny, according to Descartes, that God exists, because, again, what you'd be saying is a perfect being is imperfect. It lacks one of the perfections, namely existence. One important issue, or one important question for Descartes, is why he thinks of existence as a perfection. In what way is existing being perfect? I think the easiest way to get a handle on this is just to work through an example. So imagine something that does exist but goes out of existence. So suppose that there's some organization or company that exists, and then it goes out of existence. Maybe it faced greater competition, or maybe demand for its products went away, or maybe some new legislation came in that it couldn't cope with. In one way or another, this organization went out of existence. Had the organization been perfectly run and perfectly resourced, then it wouldn't have gone out of existence. So it went out of existence because it was in some way or other imperfect. And it was an imperfect organization, and that meant that it was vulnerable to market forces, or it was vulnerable to changes in policy, or something of that kind. So a perfect company would carry on. So that kind of example, I think, gives you a sense of what Descartes has in mind when he says that existence is a perfection, that if something is truly perfect, then it will exist and continue to exist and persist in its existence. So a truly perfect being will be not only a being that exists, but a being that exists eternally. So if we think about examples like that, we start to get a handle on what Descartes might mean when he says that existence is a perfection. You might wonder if that claim, that existence is a perfection, faces some obvious problems. So think about child murderers, for example, or horrible diseases. Aren't these things imperfections, or aren't these respects in which reality is imperfect, that it contains such things as child murderers or diseases? So you might think that casts doubt on Descartes' claim that existence is a perfection. Well, Descartes definitely recognizes that there are things in reality that are imperfect, and he includes himself in that. So he's not claiming that everything that exists is fully perfect. The way to understand his claim, I think, is as the claim that the more that something exists, the more of reality it occupies, the more perfect it is. And the most perfect thing is the thing that takes up as much of reality as possible, the thing that exists for the longest time and exists in a way that is independent of anything else that's going on in reality. So what Descartes' claiming is that not that everything that exists is perfect, but that the more something exists, the more perfect it is. And to be maximally perfect is to be something that exists eternally and in a way that is can't be destroyed or changed or undermined by other things that exist. So the company wasn't perfect because it didn't exist eternally, and it didn't exist because other things were influencing it and were able to undermine it in some way. So hopefully those kinds of examples give you a bit of a handle on what it means to suggest that existence is a perfection. As I mentioned, when we're thinking about the ontological argument and also the argument that I referred to earlier as the trademark argument, they both have the common starting place, which is the claim that Descartes has an idea of God, or in my own case, that I have an idea of God. And this is supposed to be, as I said, a starting point that everyone can accept, because the atheist is supposed to agree that they have an idea of God. After all, they think that God doesn't exist, so they have to have an idea of the thing that they deny the existence of. However, one way that you might resist both the ontological argument and the trademark argument is by rejecting that starting point and denying that we really do have an idea of God, where, on Descartes' view, to have an idea of God is to have the idea of an infinitely perfect being. And you might think that some of the points that Descartes himself makes speak against the possibility of having such an idea, because we are ourselves imperfect creatures, we're finite creatures, we have limited capacities, and so you might say, how can we imperfect finite creatures really have an idea of infinity or perfection? And this is a point that some of Descartes' contemporaries made in correspondence with him. They denied the starting point of both arguments, or at least challenged it. Perhaps we don't really have an idea of God, because the idea of God is the idea of infinite perfection, and we ourselves are imperfect and finite and limited. Descartes does have a reply to this move, and it's a very interesting one. Roughly, and again, these are contemporary terms, they're not quite the terms that Descartes uses, but roughly what he says is this: we might want to distinguish merely having an idea from fully grasping that idea. In the case of perfection, what Descartes wants to say is, well, we do have that idea, even though as finite, limited creatures, we don't fully grasp or fully comprehend the idea. So part of Descartes' way of thinking about this is that we can have ideas in our minds, even if we don't fully grasp the idea, where grasping an idea is kind of appreciating it fully, understanding fully its implications, really having a clear idea as to what it involves. And what he concedes to his critic is that we don't have a full or adequate grasp of the idea of perfection, and we couldn't because we're not ourselves perfect. But we do have the idea, and that's all he needs, he thinks, to get the arguments for the existence of God to go through. He doesn't require that we can grasp the idea, he just requires that we have it. And that's why he thinks that that particular criticism is ineffective. As we discussed earlier, Descartes' project, or the starting point for his project, is to try to find a secure foundation for inquiry. So a solid foundation on which he and others can build our scientific knowledge and our understanding of reality and of our place in it. And to identify that starting point, Descartes recommends that we reject any belief or any proposition or any claim that is open to doubt. To reveal just how much is open to doubt, Descartes invites us to consider a scenario in which we're being deceived by what he calls an evil demon. So Descartes doesn't really believe that there's an evil demon out there deceiving us. He's just saying it's at least possible that there is some all-powerful, malevolent demon that is manipulating us. So it might seem to me that I'm sat on a chair talking to another person right now next to a desk, but it's possible that those images are being fed to me by this evil demon, manipulating my mind to make it appear to me that these things are happening when in fact they're not. Even more radically, I might have thought that there were certain principles of mathematics or logic that I took to be completely immune from doubt. So I might be fully confident that 1 and 1 is 2, or that triangles have 3 sides, and I might think that these things at least are not open to doubt. But what Descartes is trying to suggest with the evil demon hypothesis is that even these things are open to doubt. I might be confident that 1 and 1 is 2, but perhaps there's an evil demon that is manipulating my capacities of reasoning so that 1 and 1 isn't 2, but every time I try to think it through, the demon manipulates me into arriving at the false belief that 1 and 1 is 2. So let's suppose that 1 and 1 is 5, and I'm counting 1, and I count another 1, and then just as I'm about to arrive at my conclusion, the demon manipulates my mind and makes me to conclude that 1 and 1 is 2. So in appealing to the demon in this way, what Descartes is trying to say is that even principles of logic and mathematics and geometry are open to doubt. So at this point in Descartes' reflections, it seems like everything is open to doubt. The possibility of this evil demon manipulating us might seem to leave nothing whatsoever that is immune from doubt. But, Descartes suggests, there is at least one thing that is not open to doubt, and that is his own existence. Why is that not open to doubt? Well, because the very activity of doubting assures Descartes of his existence, because doubting is a form of thinking, and if you're thinking, then you must exist in order to be doing the thinking. Where there's thinking going on, there's a thinker who's having the relevant thoughts. One objection that you might have to Descartes at this stage, and which some of his contemporaries pressed upon him, was, doesn't the evil demon, or the possibility of an evil demon, even undermine the cogito, as it's been called? Because just as I might start with the thought of one thing and start with the thought of another thing, and then be manipulated into thinking that there are two things, so just as the demon might manipulate my powers of reasoning in the mathematical case, so the demon might be manipulating my powers of reasoning when I'm thinking about my own existence. I start by noticing that there's thinking going on, and I conclude that I must exist, but maybe the demon is just tricking me or manipulating me into thinking this. So another way to put that is that the way that the cogito is often presented is it looks like an argument. I think, therefore I am. I'm starting from a premise that I'm thinking, and I'm concluding on the basis of that premise that I exist. But if the demon is undermining my capacity for reasoning, doesn't it also undermine my reasoning from the fact that there's thinking going on to the fact that I exist? So this is an issue that's long puzzled scholars thinking about Descartes and trying to make sense of his argument. And one way to reply to it is to say, well, In this case, we don't really have an argument, although we might be tempted to put it in ways that suggest it's an argument. I think, therefore I am. It's not really an argument at all. Rather, to return to a notion that we were talking about earlier, my own existence is something that I can just intuit or kind of see. So my own existence is manifest in the fact that I'm thinking. It's not that I notice that I'm thinking and then draw the conclusion from it that I exist. Rather, in noticing that I'm thinking, I thereby can see or intuit or have the intuition that I must exist. So this would suggest that the cogito is not vulnerable to the kinds of skeptical worries that the evil demon hypothesis are introducing, because I'm not reasoning from the fact that I'm thinking to the fact that I exist. I'm just seeing as a self-evident truth that I exist in the very fact that I'm thinking. So there's no step involved that the demon could interfere with or undermine. And that's why Descartes seems to think his own existence is something he can be certain of, even if he can't be certain of anything else, including mathematical truths. We can put the point that I was just trying to articulate on Descartes' behalf in terms of the distinction between intuition and deduction. So I'll start with deduction because that's easier. When you deduce something, what you do is you start from a claim, a premise, and deduce a conclusion. So you draw from the premise some kind of conclusion. So if I know, for example, that there's an apple in front of me and I know that there's a banana in front of me, I might deduce that there are two pieces of fruit in front of me. So from two claims, I've deduced a further claim. That is to say, I've drawn a consequence from those first two claims. If you know that there's a banana in front of you and you know there's an apple in front of you, you can deduce that there are two pieces of fruit in front of you. Intuition isn't supposed to involve deduction, at least as the term is often used. It's rather a matter of just seeing the truth of something, or the truth of something impressing itself upon you. So if you, setting aside worries about evil demons, when I reflect on the proposition that 1 and 1 is 2, I can just see the truth of it. When I reflect upon the proposition that 1 and 1 is 2, I can just see the truth of it. Its truth is just manifest to me. Just in grasping the proposition, I can appreciate that it must be true. So when you know something by intuition, when you intuit it, you're not making a step from one claim to some other claim. You're just appreciating the truth of a claim all by itself. How does that relate to the cogito? Well, the point that I was just trying to make on Descartes' behalf is that Descartes seems to think that he doesn't arrive at knowledge of his own existence through deduction. He doesn't deduce that he exists from the fact that he's thinking. Rather, he's assured of his own existence thanks to intuition. He can just see as a self-evident truth that he exists in the fact that he's thinking. So just as in reflecting on the proposition that 1 and 1 is 2, I can come to see its truth, so in reflecting on the fact that I'm thinking, I can come to see that I must exist. Not by drawing that out as a consequence, but just by reflecting on the very thing itself.
Thank you very much for listening, and if you were on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe for any new content coming out. The next episode will be regarding the limits of knowledge and discussing skepticism, with my guest being a current PhD student here at the University of Southampton,